Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to talk about the breakdown in relations between Hitler and Stalin, Operation Barbarossa, and really the beginning of the end for Hitler's Germany. So, here are our objectives for today. Let's take a moment to take them in, and then we'll dive in and talk about how Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union really spelled doom for his Nazi war machine. As you hopefully remember, Hitler and Stalin had a non aggression pact where they agreed not to attack each other while Hitler took care of Western Europe, sort of the completion of the Schlieffen Plan from World War I, and that everything was going relatively well for Hitler in World War II up to this point. Hitler's planned invasion of the Soviet Union was, of course, to take control of these areas of Eastern Europe, execute the Hunger Plan, and resettle a lot of these areas with Germans in order to give him the Lebensraum that he's sort of been talking about. And so the planned invasion of the Soviet Union had three prongs here. One was to attack the northern port city and former capital that used to be St. Petersburg and, of course, is now Leningrad. The second was to take the capital of Moscow and decapitate the Soviet government. And the third was to take the sort of agricultural regions of Ukraine and then take the industrial city of Stalingrad, kind of decapitating Soviet industry and preventing them from, being able to produce the things necessary to continue the war effort. So here's Hitler describing and laying out his whole plan. So take a moment, pause, read, and then we'll move forward. With Hitler's invasion, Stalin had a mental breakdown. He went into isolation for a while. Historians kind of struggle with this period because Stalin doesn't seem like a guy who would have been taken off guard by stuff like this. But it seems like he really truly misjudged Hitler. Hitler is one of those historical figures where, in hindsight, it's super clear what he's after. But at the time, everyone, Neville Chamberlain and Stalin, and to some degree, other leaders included, really misjudged him and didn't think he was capable of the stuff that he ended up doing. Really, the saving grace for Stalin is that, as we've talked about before in this class, Russia is so large that it's going to take a spectacular effort for the Nazi blitzkrieg to be able to take over Russia. And so that's going to give Stalin time to sort of overcome his emotional breakdown, come out of isolation, and start organizing a response. Here's a description of the Nazi invasion and the scope of it. So take a moment, pause, read, and then we'll move forward. Hitler's invasion really did bring in overwhelming force, and the Red Army was totally overmatched in the early phases of this blitzkrieg. Stalin, once he came to his senses, made the monumentous decision to really abandon a lot of Soviet industry in sort of the West there, to take the factories apart, sometimes almost literally brick by brick, ship them eastward, and then rebuild and reestablish Soviet industry outside of the reach of the Nazi attack. And so, using his sort of totalitarian control over his society, Stalin was able to force the Soviet Union to remake its entire industry out in the West, meaning that even if the Nazis, worst case scenario, took all their objectives and all their major cities, the Soviets would still be able to continue to produce war materials and continue the fight. The Germans, in their invasion of Soviet Russia, used incredibly brutal tactics. So pause, take this in. The war really became a war of extermination for both sides. The Germans treated the Russians incredibly harshly. As you can see here, captured troops, captured officers, communist officials would be liquidated. And these atrocities and this mass killing of Russians is going to lead to incredibly harsh feelings after the war, and is really going to also affect the way the Red Army is going to behave towards both Germans and captured territories afterwards. In the three fronts, in the early year of the invasion, the Germans are going to have pretty substantial gains, taking a significant amount of what is today Ukraine, pushing close to Moscow, and pushing right to the edges of Leningrad. And so we see sweeping, just like we saw in France, and we saw in Poland, and we saw in Greece, and we saw in Norway and Denmark. The Nazi blitzkrieg is going to be pretty substantially successful, taking huge amounts of territory. Stalin is going to issue orders that they're going to resist at all costs. The two famous orders are the no step back, basically refusing to allow the Russian army to retreat under any circumstances, and advocating that the Russian people adopt a scorched earth policy. and not authorizing any surrender for Russian troops, famously stating that, quote, there will be no Soviet prisoners of war, only traitors. Basically, that if the Germans don't kill you once you get out of the POW camp, we will. And so these incredibly harsh methods made the Russian soldiers, basically forced Russians to fight to the last man. And pause and read this. The destruction of all sort of productive capacity, all food, all infrastructure, similarly to how the Russians burned a lot of their own infrastructure when Napoleon was invading. This strategy of scorched earth is going to make it really, really difficult on the Nazi invaders to, really live off the land at all, meaning that they're going to have to import everything they need from Germany. And as they continue to advance into Russia, this means that their supply lines are going to get incredibly long and complicated. It also means that that the Russians are going to be able to bleed the Germans. And as the Russian weather begins to change, the same thing that's going to happen to Napoleon's Grand Army when he marched into Russia is going to happen to Hitler and the Germans. The Germans are going to find nothing but ashes in the areas that they take. And this is going to really, really sap German morale going forward. In the north, the Germans are going to surround, and rather than attempt to take the great city of St. Petersburg, of Leningrad, they're going to try to starve the people out, basically set up a perimeter around and allow no food in. They're going to bomb the city almost continuously. And for the people of Leningrad, this is going to be incredibly, incredibly unpleasant. They're going to eat literally everything that they have and be surviving on almost nothing. Stalin, of course, is going to order no surrender, and so there's going to be no surrender for the forces within Leningrad. And in the end, the Russian winter is going to some degree save the Leningraders as they're able to establish convoys across frozen lakes and the frozen ice to be able to bring in food and things like that to help the city barely survive. For the people of Leningrad, this was utterly horrific, but it does allow them to hold out for long enough for the attacks on the other fronts to sort of start to peter out. Near Moscow, the Germans are going to be slowed by a combination of incredibly difficult rains during the fall years and then an early snow. The early snow near Moscow is going to make it difficult for the German troops. Hitler, using his sort of stereotypical overconfidence, had ordered that his troops not bring in winter clothing, which is going to be really problematic once the temperature starts to drop. And the German equipment had not been designed to work in cold temperatures, especially the temperatures that they're finding sort of in the interior of Russia. And so this is going to slow down German troops, and they're not going to be able to get to Moscow. So take a moment, pause and read, and let's move on. With the German army stalled, the Soviet war machine is going to get going in earnest. They're going to start pumping out new types of equipment that are more effective at surviving the winter. You're going to see troops with winter clothing and things like that. And the fact that the Japanese have now bombed Pearl Harbor and are mired down in a fight both in the Pacific and, of course, in China means that the Soviets can move their troops off the border with China and Japan. And so we're going to see Siberian forces coming in with skis and with winter clothes that are acclimated and ready to fight. And so we're going to see new Russian troops pouring in as the German numbers start to dwindle and the winter takes hold. The Russian effective resistance to the Germans is going to really prevent Hitler from obtaining his objectives and be utterly devastating to the Nazi war machine. And in the South, probably the harshest fighting in all of the European theater of World War II up to this point is Stalingrad. Stalingrad is a massive industrial city on the Volga, and the split of the city between the area controlled by the Germans and the area controlled by the Russians is going to be incredibly fierce. Fighting is going to happen building to building with both sides entrenching, attempting to take territory, counterattacking, and again, fighting in this incredibly difficult urban area. In the end, the Russians are going to be able to stop the German advance, and the fact that the Russians are still pumping out new equipment, new vehicles, things like that, and the fact that the Russian Air Force is capable of flying in winter, which the German Air Force is not able to do as well, leads to the eventual surrounding of the German army. Hitler rather than ordering a retreat, is going to try to order his army to fight on, and they're going to be surrounded and eventually annihilated by the Russians. The destruction of this southern part of the pincer is going to utterly doom the Nazi war effort and lead to German forces having to retreat from Russia. So much like Napoleon, about 120 years before this, the Nazi troops are going to retreat out of Russia with Russian forces hot on their heels. The Germans are going to lose millions and millions of men in Russia. And this is going to really spell doom for the German war offensive. The Blitzkrieg has now been firmly stopped. The oil reserves in the Caucasus area and around the Caspian Sea are preserved, and the Red Army is going to start pushing back. The Russians are going to treat the Germans and the freed peoples of Eastern Europe with equal brutality as the Germans did. They're going to execute huge amounts, honestly, unthinkable amounts of German prisoners. And the people of Eastern Europe are going to be double victimized, having first been victimized by the Germans coming through and now punished by the Russians for their surrender. The Russian general Zhukov is going to lead this offensive, and really you see this sort of irrepressible tide of the Red Army rising and pushing back into Nazi Germany. Hitler's last days are ahead of him here. The Russians and Stalin have stopped the German war machine, and it's almost inevitable that they will be able to take the city of Berlin and destroy Hitler's Germany. And so this really is the end of World War II in Europe. We still have some other fronts to talk about. The Allies and the Americans are pushing back in North Africa and are conquering Italy. We still have to talk about D-Day and American sort of participation in the European theater. But it's really at Stalingrad that the doom of Nazi Germany happens, and that the Americans are now offered the opportunity to strike at Nazi weak points, with the vast majority of Hitler's best troops now bogged down in Russia and dying in huge numbers. So we'll leave it there. We'll leave it there for now. When we pick it up next time, we'll talk about the American and British involvement in other theaters, and we'll really start to bring World War II in Europe to a close. So thank you for listening.